Recently, many experts and analysts have begun to wonder why French President Emmanuel Macron is so desperately trying to take on Napoleon's uniform and cast himself in the role of a great commander. Well, I have already answered this question in one of my recent videos. However, owing to the fact that this French fan of older women still does not calm down with his Napoleonic ambitions, I sometimes have to bring up this topic again. Moreover, as time has shown, the French president has not yet abandoned the idea of sending Western troops to Ukraine, even though many NATO countries have officially rejected this insane proposal by the French leader. Surprisingly, despite this, the French president reiterated that Paris has no red lines regarding assistance to Kiev, and that France will do everything to ensure that Russia does not win in Ukraine. At the same time, it is worth recognizing that against the background of such provocative statements by the French leader, Paris has significantly increased the supply of weapons to the Kiev regime. In particular, we are talking about such weapons systems as the Caesar self-propelled guns and the aerial bombs Hammer. Moreover, over the past few months, the number of French mercenaries and representatives of the so-called Foreign Legion has increased significantly in Ukraine. Let me remind you that during February and March of this year, the Russian military department officially announced the destruction of more than 100 French mercenaries on the territory of Ukraine. However, it seems that this is not enough for the French president, and he continues to inflame the situation, increasing the risk of escalation of the conflict. Moreover, France and the United Kingdom continue to exert enormous pressure on Germany in order to force Chancellor Olaf Scholz to transfer long-range Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine. And it seems that the German leader has begun to succumb to this pressure. In particular, he said that Germany would transfer its long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine, but only if the United States did the same. In other words, Olaf Scholz once again hid behind his master's back in Washington, hoping to absolve himself of responsibility for future unpredictable consequences. However, judging by the leaked audio recording of high-ranking German army officers, where they openly discussed the plan for a missile attack on the Crimean Bridge, using Taurus cruise missiles, the German authorities are unlikely to be able to avoid responsibility. Moreover, in this audio recording, high-ranking German army officers also openly stated that US, French, and British troops are already on the territory of Ukraine, and that officers and soldiers of these countries are operating complex Western weapons systems that had been transferred to the armed forces of Ukraine. Against this background, more and more Western experts are calling on France, the United States, and Britain to stop and not escalate the conflict. In particular, the authoritative military expert and officer of the Austrian Armed Forces, Markus Reisner, called on the West to admit its defeat in Ukraine as soon as possible. According to him, the West underestimated Russia's military capabilities and turned out to be completely unprepared for a positional war. The Austrian expert is confident that in order to correct the current situation, the West will have to send about 5-6 military trains with weapons to Ukraine every week. However, Western countries will never take such a step, since such large-scale shipments of weapons to Ukraine will finally empty even the weapons depots intended for Western armies. Moreover, weekly large-scale arms shipments will be impossible to hide from Russian intelligence, and these military echelons with Western weapons will become easy prey for Russian missiles, drones, and sabotage groups. At the same time, the Austrian expert admitted that in just a few months of fighting, the armed forces of Ukraine not only lost almost all Western heavy military equipment, but also air defense systems. At the same time, it is also worth paying attention to the words of another German expert, Ulrich Schmidt. In particular, during his interview with Swiss journalists from the Tageblatt newspaper, he bluntly stated that French President Emmanuel Macron, by making provocative statements against Russia, is putting himself in a ridiculous position. According to a German expert, the French president's calls to send armies of Western countries to Ukraine look very stupid, since any escalation of the conflict could lead to a harsh reaction from Russia, which is a nuclear power with the world's largest number of nuclear missiles. Moreover, even Poland, being one of the most Russophobic countries in Europe, refused to support the calls of the French leader. By the way, commenting on what is happening in Ukraine, a military expert and retired German general, who served as chief of staff of the German armed forces, Harald Kujat, bluntly stated that even if the West sends all its weapons to Ukraine, including all fighter jets and cruise missiles, Russia will still achieve all its goals, and will not allow the West to win. Meanwhile, the situation on the battlefield is becoming more and more difficult for the armed forces of Ukraine. War correspondents note that against the background of numerous successes of Russian troops along the entire front line, the number of Ukrainian soldiers who surrendered has increased rapidly. So, on March 18, war correspondents reported that in the Donetsk direction of the front, near the village of GEORGIEVKA, a whole platoon of the armed forces of Ukraine surrendered to Russian troops. According to the Russian military, this Ukrainian platoon surrendered after Russian artillery bombarded its positions for several hours. It is reported that the commander of the Ukrainian platoon, using a special radio communication wave, called on Russian troops to stop the shelling and made it clear that he and his soldiers were surrendering. Moreover, as it turned out, Ukrainian soldiers and officers refused to return to Ukraine as part of the prisoner exchange, and asked the Russian side to leave them in a prisoner camp until the end of the war. At the same time, the Russian military claims that the number of Ukrainian soldiers who refuse to return to Ukraine is growing every day.